everyone. Good evening. My name is Christophe Migon, and welcome to Art Now. And Art Now is both a course and a speaker series presented by the Department of Visual Arts at Western University. I want to start by acknowledging the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples whose traditional lands we are gathered upon today. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And by respect, I think that could mean, amongst other things, listening and learning, and then acting and advocating. First of all, a reminder that the Q&A function of Zoom is open as of now, and you're welcome to start asking questions whenever. There'll be a Q&A section at the end, and that this talk is being recorded. So our guest today hails from Vancouver, and one of the small advantages from having a series online is that I was able to invite a few people who we would not have been able to bring physically unless there were other related events or exhibitions in the area. One thing that has always struck me about Germaine Koh's work is works in plural, I should say, is the many hats that she wears. And I don't even know if it's worth being, well, if it would be possible to be exhaustive about the list of things. Artist, I guess, would be foremost, but maybe the hierarchy doesn't need to be stated as I just did. Teacher, builder, curator, and I think the list could, writer, the list could go on. And I think there's an integral way of how she deploys all these facets of her activities that has this, I mean, there are recurrences, if you will. One of the pieces, and the piece that advertised this talk is a piece called Fallow, which I always loved. I didn't, still love, but I didn't get a chance to see it in person. One thing that struck me about the writing that Germaine did on that piece was that kind of in a half self-deprecating, half boasting, that it was her most rejected project or proposal, I suppose. And I quite like that element of failure that is injected. And it seems, and I'm glad she chose that piece as an image, because one of the lines that she said that the space lies fallow. And indeed, a lot of cultural centers, spaces right now are exactly in that situation in some way or another, be it actually or metaphorically, if you will, kind of on standstill, but with a kind of activity. There's a performative element in her piece. I don't know what that is in front of me. I guess you're not noticing, but I noticed it.
Sorry, the one with me sleeping?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, anyway, you go on.
Yes. I lost my train of thought. I was distracted by an image. No problem. The performative element is something that, given my own interest, that I've been tracking, and I like to also see it in cases where Germaine is not performing per se, but kind of maybe performing a role, I guess, would be an interesting way to put it. And maybe now jumping to some of the current work, which I know that obviously Germaine is going to talk about much more articulately and in an expansive way and from her own perspective, is a phrase or caption that she uses is community built, building community. And it's such a great catchphrase that really, I think, encapsulates one of the things I was trying to do in the programming of this course in terms of collaboration, cooperation, and its absolute necessity in these times. So without much further ado, in this semi-rambling way, I'd like for all of us to welcome, unfortunately silently, Germaine Koh.
Well, thank you, Christophe, for that that introduction. I like the conversational introduction, and in fact, you touched on some of the things that the ways that I thought I would approach this this talk. I wanted to acknowledge on my part that I'm joining you from the traditional Coast Salish territories, and I'm grateful for being here. So yes, Christophe, you know what, I'm going to just share my, start sharing my screen right away. There we go. Okay, so to distract from me as a talking head. So I was really grateful for this opportunity to speak to you. I love coming and speaking to art students, and I have this tendency to spill all of my secrets. So hopefully, if that's what you're here for, you will be rewarded. I thought I would, given this focus on questions of what is collective and questions of collectivity and care, I have chosen a whole bunch of works that focus on those kinds of questions of collective efforts, the things that we have in common, mutual care, community building, and community organizing. As Christophe alluded to, I have a practice that isn't very easily categorized. It seems kind of beside the point to do so, really. And it includes making stuff that is sometimes recognizable as artwork, sometimes not, as well as organizing activity. And I understand my role as an artist, as nominally an artist, to be about putting new ideas out into the world and furthering conversations and debates. And so to my mind, this doesn't necessarily always happen by making artwork. It can be by encouraging other people to action, and it can be about helping to shape the discussion that happens around work, and also identifying stuff that is worthy of attention that is not necessarily art. So for the purposes of this talk, because there are these really big differences in the formats of my work, I thought it'd be useful to start by flagging some of the interrelated principles that guide my decision making about how and whether to jump into situations. And so I'm talking about, you know, a certain number of values that are quite clear to me that persist throughout the really quite varied ways in which I operate, and that determine not only what form the things that I end up taking, but also whether it even makes sense for me to operate as a visible author, or whether it makes sense for me to operate behind the scenes. So some of these principles, which I've sort of collected together, and seems kind of funny to label them this way, maybe, but I've been in so many situations where someone wants the elevator pitch about what it is that I do, and I can't just say I paint or whatever. So I have to talk in terms of values and the things that I'm trying to do with my work. So one of the things that some of these principles that guide my work are about operating in a way that is implicated in the real world and in our social world, in our social exchanges, looking at the patterns of use, paying attention to our collective activities, making use of found materials and situations in the world. And related to that, this interest in the sort of patterns of collectivity are paying attention to the things that connect us, what I would call the common denominators of our experience, rather than the things that differentiate us. Another one of the kinds of guiding principles, or a set of guiding principles that drive my work, is a commitment to existing in a state of uncertainty and changeability, of really embracing process as what gets us as the most interesting thing, rather than the end product. So you'll notice that my work always ends up being, or almost always ends up being, open-ended, experimental, and in that way, the work itself is very often performative, in that we need to pay attention to, or it asks us to pay attention to how things unfold, as much as what ends up, what the end product is. It's the work that I do is very much committed to trying to create a pressing situations in the moment, where we are asked to reckon with what is in front of us. So that sometimes takes the form of works that really are only recorded through oral history. It emphasizes the fact that we are all performing in some way, whether as audience, or an audience that becomes potentially engaged, or in any case that there are consequences to all of our actions. So it really tries to set up these situations in which we're asked to pay attention to those conditions around us. And at the same time, it's asking for a certain kind of attention to the minor details that surround us. And that can be in the form of overlooked details or patterns that we never really give a second thought to. Formally, it often takes the form of a very concise or minimal presentation, or focus on a limited number of materials and exploring the richness of those. So I wanted to just identify those as some of the principles that are underlying what is going to be a very wide variety of works that I'm going to show you. As I mentioned, I pulled up really a lot of images, and so I won't dwell on anything too much, but we can always go back to any if there are questions that arise. Okay, so I thought I would lump things together, not chronologically, but rather in terms of types of formats, or families of work, I guess, if you could say. So there are, and so this work that I'm going to show you ranges through 30 years or so. Although I will generally end with some ways in which my practice is shifting a little bit. So there are a number of works, especially my earliest works, that were focused that were really focused on time, the passage of time, especially focused on labor and everyday processes. This focus, that I mentioned, on minor details. So in in the case of a work like Knit Work, which was a lifelong piece that was started back in 1992 and will be finished when I die. Although it's now in the collection of the Art Gallery of Ontario, and I sometimes go to the art gallery vaults and work on it there. So it's made by unraveling sweaters and re-knitting the wool back into this blanket-like object. It's as wide as a blanket, but continually growing. So it becomes a kind of portrait of a sort of collective portrait of the thing of everyday labors, as well as a record of the passage of time, a and a record of the decisions that have been made along the way that you can't really, undo. Like, for example, this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this really bright portion in the middle, which is, which I think looks terribly gaudy, but was, is just a thing that I have to live. So it's a bit of an exercise in acceptance as well. So works like that focus on patterns of use and production. Here's another work that's in that vein, that's called A Cord of Wood, which is also a cord of wood, that is going to transform as it moves from location to location. So this was it when it was first presented at the Kamloops Art Gallery, and this is a cord of local wood, which is suffering from the pine beetle infestations. So it has an interesting provenance as well. And the idea is that this wood is going to travel along with all the administrative documents that make it possible, and that document how it has perhaps accrued in value, or how its value changes as its shape changes. So so it no longer exists in this form that you see. It is it exists as sorry, I'm going to not look at the chat, okay? And maybe Christoph, if there's something that if you can keep track of it and let me maybe flag to me if there's something that I need to pay attention to, maybe that makes sense. Sorry, so it's so it now exists as a bunch of timbers and a bunch of sawdust, and eventually it probably will get built into something, and I'm guessing that maybe as it starts to look more like a cultural object, it might gain in value. At the same time, as it moves from location to location, it may need to be treated and so on. So if I ever were to send this overseas, this thing would need to be heat or chemically treated and so on. So those documents that you see on the left-hand side are some of those administrative documents. Now it's happening. Okay, there we go. There's a work, some of the works have a much more minimal presence. So this one is called Pole, and it is a pole, fence pole, that is planted in the middle of a walking path, and we toss down some grass seed at the same time as it's planted. And then over time, it becomes the occasion to see and observe changes in the space around it. So it becomes like a kind of pointer pointing to the everyday patterns of use that exist around it. The fact that people will that the walking path will change over time. The fact that this path even exists is being a kind of a unrecognized will of the people that use the space, and so on. I think of this work as being very similar to knit work. In fact, it's called Prayers. And what it is doing is I've added a computer onto an existing computer network, and that computer is essentially spying on one of the other computers on the network. And it's capturing all of the keystrokes that are entered on that computer, translating them to Morse code, and then sending some Morse encoded smoke signals out the side of the building. So it's a piece that is it has a very different physical presence than knit work, but I feel like it is doing much the same thing. It's trying to pay attention to the unacknowledged labor that shapes the world around us. In this case, it has a very fleeting physicality that is somehow appropriate. It felt like the appropriate way to memorialize this action that we're also now very familiar with, of typing emails and then you hit send and it goes out into the world. So it was trying to really trying to literalize that in some way, as well as make connections with a whole lineage of communications communications technologies, going back to steam power and the Morse code and the telegraph, and trying to tie our digital communications today to those. There are some situations that are, although I've mentioned that a lot of my work is performative and it's not only me performing, there are some works that in which I am indeed the performer, although I'm always acting as a kind of every person, a stand-in for a kind of, for types of, no, I shouldn't say generic, but types of common behaviors that so exploring those kinds of known social situations. So this is a piece in which I slept in unconventional situations, in improper situations. So in this case, it was outside my then dealer's booth at the at an art fair, and I've also done it in a nightclub. So the situation is recognizable, of course. We are always used to walking by people that are sleeping on the streets, but this is me transferred into an improper situation. And so like fallow, it's really a matter of transferring a known type of situation into an unexpected setting, and that is what provokes the kind of conversation about why these patterns are acceptable and so acceptable that they become invisible in some situations, but remarkable in others. So there's that. Oops. There's a piece that was actually performed 9 years ago this week at Nuit Blanche in Toronto. And this was a piece that when Christophe, when you mentioned that the question of failure, it was like I thought you were going to go towards this piece, but you didn't. This is, if not a failure, it was definitely the most unpleasant art making experience I've ever had. So and it came about because I had been planning a different piece for Nuit Blanche, and that didn't end up going through. And so I finally told them, okay, well, I'm just gonna take a rock from Northern Ontario and I'm gonna roll it down Yonge Street, which you love to talk about as the longest street in the world, and we're gonna add it to the waterfront. And they said, oh yeah, we like that idea, so let's do that. And so my team, so I assembled this team of 4 people, and we, over the course of 4 days, plus the overnight of Nuit Blanche, we rolled this 850-pound granite boulder from Thornhill down to the waterfront of Toronto and added it there. And it was another attempt to focus on the rarely acknowledged ways in which labor and shapes the world around us. So it's in a certain way, it was kind of like trying to recreate some very slow processes, and slow and difficult to perceive processes, like geological processes, and the ways in which a city is shaped over time. And it acknowledges the fact that, in fact, Toronto's waterfront is fully engineered waterfront. The lakeshore is now much further. Sorry, the original lakeshore was quite a bit further back than where it is now. So that was changed over time, and so it was a way of trying to pay tribute to these kinds of labors which shape our world. But it was just a horrible experience, doing this, rolling this rock through the middle of the bar scene on Yonge Street in the middle of the night as the bars were letting out. And this was the one occasion where I almost had to come to blows with members of the so-called audience who were harassing us as we went. that is in contrast to this other performance that I've done, this other urban intervention, which was also a fight, but a mutual one, let's say. This is a project that Jade Root and I did, site-specific kind of urban intervention. So this is one of a number of urban interventions I've done on the site that's at the foot of University Avenue, at where it meets Front Street. And this site doesn't exist in this way anymore. At the time, it was this green space with this funny concrete pad protected by chains, which I always thought looked like a boxing ring. So I challenged Jade Rood to fight me, to meet me on that site and fight at high noon on a weekday. So and we had planted in the audience someone with a bike and a bike bell, and she would ring her bell to start and stop the rounds. We fought for 3 rounds. And it was completely unannounced in this location, which many of you will know the space is surrounded by a lot of tall office buildings. So it has this kind of spectatorial situation that it feels almost like a coliseum. And knowing that this is part of the business district of Toronto, I was reflecting on the fact that this is a place where for all kinds of staged meetings and encounters, and these kind of ritualized encounters. And to me, that felt like very, or I was reflecting on the fact that bore some similarities to the kinds of encounters that you have in sports and other kinds of ritualized meetings. So you'll already start to see that in my work, very often it's a case of taking one set of circumstances and practice and ways of operating and meshing that or crossing that with another set, and it's in that kind of that collision that there's a productive thinking and reflection on the kinds of patterns that are being pointed at, right? Now there's a couple other urban interventions I've done. This one is basically looks like I built a kind of generic bus shelter on the inside of this gallery space, and then I knocked out one of their display windows so that you could only access the space from the street. So you had to step over the wall of this what looks like a bus shelter, and this is and so this space inside the shelter exists in the quite uneasy in between space that made the gallery space feel quite vulnerable in some way, because you could tell that it was which okay, so I want to say, so that was it was a little bit of at the same time as it made the gallery space feel vulnerable, it was, I think one could understand as a viewer that that was more of an emotional effect than anything, because the structure that I built on the inside was every bit as physically secure as the storefront space ever was, but there was this feeling that, and the first reaction that many people had was, oh, the homeless people are going to go and use this space, and so there was this kind of recognition of how that it was inviting a particular kind of behavior that was that's not normally invited in this kind of setting. So and the space was used. I don't know that anyone ever did sleep there, and I think there was a number of circumstances such that it wasn't really going to happen, but people certainly use it as shelter, particularly because it's the kind of it was a return to a kind of structure that it isn't normally it becomes increasingly rare, right? Like people, you may or may not have noticed, but transit shelters these days don't tend to have very much, to actually provide very much shelter, precisely because the way of planning these days is to discourage people from loitering or spending an undue amount of time. And so that's the reason that you have, like on benches where you have raised sections between the different seating areas and so on. It's precisely to prevent people from sleeping and becoming comfortable in our shared space. So that's a kind of question that this piece tries to open, is how comfortable are we prepared to let people be in our shared space, right? I've done a whole series of these human scaled spider webs. So this is under the, what is that street called in Toronto? What is, anyway, I'm forgetting, under one of the bridges. Anyway, I climbed up, and this particular image involved my climbing up into the, under the bridge and building this spider web. So it's a whole series of human scaled spider webs built out of, that I've make out of string. And it's as a way of kind of marking the city in terms of places that could be good places to exist without being disturbed or without being seen. So this is a piece that is bound for failure in the sense of, if you're considering, if you assume that I'm making work to be seen by a very wide public. Rather, I think this is work that's being that's a matter of marking the city for the people who are willing to look at it, who are willing to look in the crevices and willing to look at the the corners and of the city, willing to look to the sides of the tourist attractions. And so it's in the realm of hobo signs, for example. It's a kind of think of it as a kind of private language for those who need it. So I've done, this is a series that's ongoing. I've continued to do it to this day. So those are some of the works I've done that in the realm of unannounced and unauthorized urban interventions. There's some works that also engage with the urban context that are more sanctioned, such as this work Fallow that Christophe mentioned, which I've produced in a couple different situations, or a couple different cities now. This is the version that was at the Charles H. Scott Gallery in Vancouver, and I'd previously done it at Kunstlerhaus Britannien in Berlin. The basic premise is that we go out into we go and find a nearby empty lot and basically scrape off the top layer of soil and plants and weeds and just transfer that into the gallery for the course of for the duration of an exhibition period, and just let it grow. And so it is, hopefully engaging with questions about how our perceptions of value and how that shifts when this exterior space is transposed into the gallery, and so you may see yourself paying a lot of attention to the weeds and the growth of these plants and the little bugs that crawl around, in a way that you wouldn't if this stuff was back in the empty lot that it originated in. It's an occasion to reflect upon the value of empty land. It's an occasion to reflect on our notions of productivity. I mean, we're used to assuming that the stuff that we see in galleries is an end product, right? Rather than rather than a kind of process or part of a continuum. And also, you know, it's hoping to raise certain kinds of questions around um, the value of downtime in some way, right? And whether the pressures to produce are all that really. So this is it's a work that I've gone back and reflected upon, especially in these COVID times, where we're starting to realize, I think, that what is really a really essential part of the worlds in which we operate are taking care of the conditions of production, right? Our supply chains, and taking care of ensuring the health of the conditions in which we make stuff, right? So this was an exhibition that was really like all about just caring for the stuff that happened to be there, and focusing on the world around us, right? Okay, I don't want to dwell too much, though. We can dwell some more later if you want. Here's a work in which that's also engaged with the urban environment, but it takes place within an art gallery. So this is was the space that Center A occupied in the downtown east side of Vancouver, which, as many of you probably know, is a neighborhood that is marked by some very difficult conditions, which includes a lot of substance abuse, a lot of people living in poverty, a lot of people unhoused. And as a part of that, there's a lot of people who are making a living by collecting bottles around town and bringing them in for refunds. So we worked with a bottle depot down the street called United We Can, and over the course of several months, I went and got from them all of the bottles that they received that they couldn't give people a refund for. So these are actually, in terms of the local economy, that unofficial economy, these are actually worthless. And so I collected them over the course of months and months, and there was a whole process of cleaning them and essentially caring for them, rehabilitating them in some way, and then including them into this shifting installation, which would change as people develop different paths to walk through it and so on. And it was a really interesting situation because it upended also our notions of expertise. So a lot of the people that would walk by this space, of course, it's very striking to look in and see all of these bottles, but the neighborhood folks, sorry, that's a generalization, that was an unfortunate choice of words, but a lot of people in the neighborhood would recognize that these were, in terms of the economy, worthless. And so it somehow upends this notion, or the systems of value in some way, and the people that, and a lot of people would come into the gallery and remark to the gallery, the folks attending the gallery, that this material was worthless. So it also it created a situation in which the people in the neighborhood were the real experts about this material, rather than the gallery, rather than the art gallery, right? So which is used to framing, or used to assuming this kind of notion of, or this position of authority as being the arbiter of what is valuable and what isn't. So that was quite an interesting situation, and the piece was actually also adopted locally as being a kind of memorial to victims of alcoholism and substance abuse in the downtown east side. So that turned out well. And I am also going to show you some failures, though. Those are coming up pretty soon. So there are a number of works that really focus on the situations of social exchange and specifically of play that I set up. So here is a public art commission that that was actually, speaking of failures, this took 10 years to go from being commissioned to actually being installed, because in the process of making this work, I'd been asked to rework it to make it less dangerous. So it's essentially a bench modeled after the ones that you see in the local transit shelters, but it's also a teeter-totter. So when there's no one on it, it just tips to one side or the other. And you could sit on it by yourself. It's located beside a bus shelter, so it's a kind of situation which people do need to spend time. So you could sit on it by yourself, crooked, or you could cooperate with a fellow citizen and have an exchange. There's a work like this. This was an installation that I made for the Biennale de Montréal, in which which was taking place in a location that used to house an old a used bookstore, and which had moved out and left behind these rooms filled with old books that were worthless. I guess not worth it for them to move elsewhere. So I used those to build this kind of face off. This kind of situation that had two sides facing off, kind of like a parliament, or I called it forum, given that it was Montreal, and that's where the tour guides would gather people to start their tours of the exhibition and so on. Here's a project that is ongoing, that is a community-based project which invites people to gather in order to play invented games and sports. And it's conceived as being every time we meet it's unknown what exactly is going to unfold. We'll sometimes start with vague instructions like bring a stick, and some people will bring hockey sticks, some people will bring lacrosse sticks. We've had people bring chopsticks and sticks of gum and so on, and we invent games and develop them collectively based on the materials at hand. And these are really interesting occasions to see what unfolds through experimentation, through trial and error, through iteration. And really, it's an exercise to me in collective problem solving, right? And play as a means of getting ourselves out of ourselves and into this kind of magical space of. This word magic is actually one that play theorists use, losing ourselves in play. I'm going to jump forward a little bit through some other works that are focused on communications, because I'm conscious that I may be talking more than I meant to. So there are other works that really focus on how we on the mediums for communication. So, for example, this is a journal that appears. It started out. It was by me placing very short journal texts in the classified ads, but as those have become obsolete, I've started using roadside message boards or LED message boards, and so these are they're real, heartfelt little snippets of an actual journal. And I think it's like, in some way, asking, it's creating a situation of vulnerability, in which we might recognize very typical kinds of situations. even though we don't know who is speaking. Here's another piece that uses Morse code. In this case, it takes control of the lights of a building. This is the Baltic Center in Newcastle. And you can text SMS messages to a mobile phone number, and it'll blink the lights of the building in Morse code. So it uses the Morse, turns the building into a kind of a lighthouse that becomes like a beacon for community messaging. This is a work that in which I gutted a vintage telephone and replaced it with programmable circuits that and this LCD display that said, for conversation, pick up handset, and you could program the phone with different people's phone numbers. What I did was program in phone numbers of people who were willing to have conversations with strangers. So when you picked up the phone, you would just hear it ring. And you go through this whole series of, I've seen so many times people go through this whole series of decision making of whether they're going to just hang up, whether they're going to let it ring and see what happens. And then when somebody picks up on to, decide whether they're going to engage with this person or not. And this is another one of those pieces that is not recorded in any way. It's just it's a kind of oral history, and it happens and lives as much in the telling of the story of the experiences as anything. Here's a piece that Christoph actually curated into a show at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, a few years ago. This is a piece that I did made with Gordon Hicks, who's a regular collaborator of mine. What we did was connect two doors over the internet. So we adapted these mechanical door closing mechanisms and attached them to two doors and connected them so that they became essentially portals to each other. So they would mirror each other's, or they would replicate each other's movements. So if you push one, the other one would move to the same position at the same speed. And so it was trying to create a situation in which you could actually communicate, or using these without words, using these objects, just using the pressure and the touch and the kind of movements. We were actually literally trying to create a new protocol for internet communication using objects and the placement of objects. And that leads me to, I'll just show you a few images I've made of works I've done that treat the built environment or that introduce kind of machines into architecture, or treat of buildings as a kind of machines. So this is a work in which I created this system of that was circulating these tens of thousands of ball bearings through some overhead tracks that look like lighting tracks, and they would drop down almost invisibly into this space and creating this and puddle around on the ground so that they became this kind of shifting topography or geography of what could be quite dangerous little objects, and creating this feeling of, or this barely perceptible movement around one. And so this was based on this is on an invitation to make work related to the Japanese Canadian museum near Toronto, and I make work in relation to their objects in their collection. And I chose some pachinko balls as my inspiration. So pachinko is this game of chance in which these little balls, steel balls, it's kind of like a cross between a slot machine and a vertical pinball machine. And so it was like this kind of game of chance. And so I was trying to create an abstract version of this game of chance, of uncertainty, and of not knowing. So I've made a whole series of works that tie together, that tie the architectural environment back to the natural environment. So in some ways, our buildings that we create around us, that we build around us, are attempts to seal ourselves off from the environment around us. These are works that try to reopen those connections. So there's been a whole series, including this turnstile, which is rotating at the speed of the wind outside, as measured by this this device I've built. This one takes control of the lights of a room and dims them as the sun goes down. So well, the wind speed, the turnstile, you can see speed up and slow down much more readily than you can the sunlight, although you can still see sort of passing clouds and so on. And as the sun sets, the lights become they tend to glow more orange. This one is creating a row of like a line of creates a line of stanchions using velvet ropes that go up and down in relation to the tide. So it's suggesting that we can pass or not, depending on the condition of the environment around us, which is a thing that we're not necessarily used to anymore, thinking of as a major factor in our lives, right? But it used to be that ships could come into or out of port. It would be the conditions of the tides and of the weather that would determine such things, right? Here's a work that is a table that is cut with a relief map of the North Shore Mountains in Vancouver, which is of course out here we're living in a what's called a subduction zone, where the tectonic plates are going to shift any moment now. I mean, geologically speaking, and cause a major earthquake. So it's this table is connected to the internet, and it shakes whenever there's news about earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest. So it's trying to recreate the sense of unease that we sort of, the abiding sense of unease that we have living in this subduction zone. Here's a public art piece that I've also made with Gordon Hicks, in which we're treating this aquatic center environment as we're exploring it as if it were a natural weather system. So we're recreating in some way the natural rain cycle by chilling air. So the air inside a pool, inside a natatorium, is very warm and humid. Increasingly more so as people use the pool, and so we're chilling that water in order to condense water, or chilling the air in order to condense water back out of the atmosphere. And then when a certain amount of that water collects, it's released from this puffy white rain cloud as rain. So there are these periodic rain showers that are caused in a roundabout way by human activity in the pool, but we can't really predict when that happens. So you'll see that a lot of those works are really they might feel perverse in that they're, or stubborn or something like that, or stubbornly not unspectacular, but it's just that they abide by different processes that are not necessarily the logic is not human. The logic is natural, right? I'm not gonna spend any time talking about these other public art pieces. I'll just mention that I've started doing public art, and I chose to do so deliberately because it means because to me it means negotiating these real world conditions. And there's sometimes not a really satisfactory way of operating, because there's always these pressures to negotiate or to compromise one's position, or one's the purity of one's position, or something like that, and so that makes it kind of challenging at some points, but it to me it underscores the there is a that there's something potentially productive about these situations of placing work integrated into the built environment. Which actually maybe brings me to, I will talk a little bit about the work that I did within the City of Vancouver's engineering services. So I just finished a couple-year term where I was acting as their artist in residence for engineering services. So engineering services is a huge portion of any city's operations, and it has to do with sewers and traffic and garbage collection and so on. And so I was the first in this position, and it was really not very well defined what that was meant to be ahead of time. So I put out a whole bunch of, or generated a whole bunch of ideas about things that we could do. And in that case, it's remarkable what is actually, the kinds of pressures that I encountered in trying in making stuff, and the kind of lack of interest in stuff that was overly abstract or not concrete, or so I would I did and managed to realize some projects, including this one, in which we invited members of the community to paint on some of the sewer pipes that were about to be added to a large sewer separation project. And so these are access pipes. And so did it with the idea that, okay, people will go away from this always being able to or having a better feeling a connection to the works in that are underground, out of view. I mean, there's these kinds of a fairly cringeworthy publicity that goes on around it, that where they have to cast it in terms of adding a splash of fun and color to the Nanaimo Street upgrades and so on. And it's a thing that, I mean, I guess we can talk about this, but as much as I cringe about that, it to me, it feels like this kind of work that I do is where I am fully immersed, not in the art world, but in the world, in the the operations of the city outside of any art worlds. And so it's the work, I feel like a lot of the work that I do is to translate the intentions that I have into words that that can be understood and communicated within that setting. So I'll finish by showing you some of the range of other things. And I'm sorry that I ended up talking so much about artwork and so and running out of time to talk about some of these other things. But basically, I've been spending more and more time operating outside of the gallery, just partly because of the sense of impotence that I have working within the contemporary art world. And my desire to make a real difference in the real world, which has always been present in my work, which I'm feeling now in a more pressing way. So I'm doing a lot of standalone projects that exist in on their own. So there's this project, for example, called Homemade Home, in which I'm proposing to design and build and explore all small space design. So as in a way of hoping to contribute to the really pressing questions that we have around housing out here, partly to give people in the community some experience building and show that this is not such a inaccessible thought that one could build one's own shelter. So these are some of the things that we've built and workshops that we've run through this project. Last summer, my team and I built this deck house to go along with the new Blue Cabin floating artist residency. And I designed all the off-grid systems. So here's some documentation of my crew. Here's some more work within the League project, and you're going to start to see that these projects have, in many ways, they have a they're a package of the project is not just the events, but the project is also the communications that happens around them, because it's because this work is trying to operate to create kind of new possibilities within this, our shared communities, right? And so it's operating outside of the established art world system, and rather, trying to propose new models for how we could operate a new and new systems and so on. So this League project has its own kind of presence as a, I'm just going to call it a project. I've done things like startup gallery spaces. This is a little street level vending space that we've turned into a gallery. And so again, my work here has both to do with curating as well as doing things like graphic design and the web and setting up the web page and so on. I've done, part of my building project was to build this little thing that looked like a phone booth structure, which is available for use as a as a kiosk or a exhibition space, a projection booth. Here the Con Lee and Andrew Lee used it as DJ booths. I've done things like start up a record label. So my partner at the time and I used to run these one-day art and music events in our apartment, which was above the Rotate This in Toronto. And that turned into, people saw us doing these things and successfully sending out communications about them, and supporting musicians. And eventually this young guy, Tony Decker, asked us if we would maybe consider releasing his album, because he couldn't find anyone to put it out. So we said, sure. And we produced the Great Lakes Swimmers first, or put out the Great Lakes Swimmers first few albums. In fact, we still continue to manage Great Lakes Swimmers. So I've done these curatorial projects, both within, established art world spaces, but also creating spaces. This was literally called the Ad Hoc Gallery, but it happened in my studio in Ottawa at the time. I've done things like, a lot of the work that I'm doing now is in kind of instigating, I will call it. So this goes back to when we put on this fundraiser based on something that once happened in my apartment, that was like a kind of wrestling match that we then turned into a fundraiser for Mercer Union. I've done things like start up non-for-profit organizations when there was a need to. So I founded Canada Roller Derby as a not-for-profit, intending to be eventually the national sport organization for roller derby. I'm trying to do the same for a new mobile art studio organization in Vancouver. And so, I really am regretting now that I didn't leave myself time to talk about this stuff. So the work that I guess I'm doing more and more work that is in the realm of kind of help expanding the possibility, or helping other people be productive in some way. So the Belkin Art Gallery, when they were considering reopening this summer, they invited me to help them with their reopening protocols. And I came up with this kind of integrated project using a metaphor of crown shyness, which is this phenomenon where trees grow distinctly separate so that they don't damage each other. So I thought that was a nice metaphor for how we can be good citizens by keeping our distance from each other. And so we turned that into entire communications campaign. So it's a little bit difficult. That included, an installation, included floor decals, and included face masks, which are available from Art Metropole if you care to go do that. Some of the other work that I've done during pandemic has been within my role at the city, was to do some creative challenges for people to work from home, to do feel a sense of togetherness while working from home. So I came up with these challenges for people to do kind of creative things, come up with new meeting formats, to produce a collective exercise video, and so on. And so the other, just I really am going to close now, to say that some of, increasingly I'm looking at my role as being one of, or I'm starting to embrace, I guess, the role that I feel like, or recognize even, and embrace the role that I have as an elder in some way, an emerging elder, I guess, if you could put it in that way. Like, so I'm doing things like supporting a scholarship at Emily Carr. It's related to the work that I've done in coaching, and now and then teaching. So I'm currently teaching a course on public art at UBC, and what I've been asking my students to just, instead of meeting virtually, to actually go out and practice being in public space, and witnessing what that feels like in these days, and not asking them to make finished work, but rather to just experiment with the ground conditions. And maybe that's just as good a place to end as any. And so I've invited my students to just, it's in the realm of coaching, right? And it's what I've been saying to them is that just showing up and trying to do something, or practicing or exercising with the conditions that are in place, already gets you some way towards a mastery or a competence in the field. And so I think I should stop speaking now, and hopefully there's some questions, and hopefully I've left at least a little bit of time for them. Yeah. Is that okay?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you, Germaine.
Yeah.
So I'll start off with a question that I'm going to paraphrase, because it's a multi-part question, but has an intriguing premise of how do you, from an art historian perspective, let's say 2 or 3 generations from now, how do you think that they will categorize your work? Or
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we all have this sense of, or no, I've decided that I'm not gonna worry too much about how my legacy is labeled. I mean, it's a question about legacy, really, that you're asking, in some way. I know that I've often struggled with and I alluded to this at the beginning, and the very fact that I sort of go to the trouble of saying, here's my value systems, essentially, is because it's so difficult to say, to identify what it is that I do, or categorize, or frame what my practice is. And to some extent, what I can do about that is to try to be clear, as I did it, or tried to do at the beginning, of what the values behind what I'm trying to do are, and explain everything I do in terms of those values. So I always, for example, when I talk to fabricators or whatever, I never say, oh, or I never take the attitude like, you don't need to understand this, just do what I want you to do. Like, that would just never be a thing I would do. Rather, I'm always engaging with the ideas that are behind the work that I'm trying to produce. And so it's hopefully it ends up being understood as being a practice of trying to further these values. Whether how that gets labeled, I don't know. I feel like I don't really, shouldn't try to control that in some way. I mean, I feel like all the best I can do is to just try to make compelling work and let the rest take care of itself. I mean, I think that's what I have to have some kind of faith in that, but at the same time I'm controlling that. I mean, increasingly so, I'm making work that is about controlling the entire package that gets put out into the world. For example, this League project, right? I mean, it's like I could very passively sort of wait for someone to invite me to go and do stuff, or I can, or what I have done is, frame an entire project that has a website that is, that is trying to be clear about what the intentions that it's trying to, the values that it's trying to further that have to do with play and with in that case and problem solving and kind of creative creative collective activity. So I can try to sort of be proactive by taking control of the communications that happen around things as well, I guess. I mean, but that is also not like, it's also because I don't necessarily have faith in the art world to do that, or to have the conditions that I want set up, right? Like, it's not, if I want to invite the general public, they're not going into an art gallery. So I need to set up, I need to frame that work, that project in a way that makes it accessible to the public that I want, right? I have to create the conditions, essentially.
Yeah, and I should credit the question to Haley Watson, who she mentions the ready-mades, which I think is an interesting example in the sense of bringing everyday objects into an art context. And she posed a question quite early on in your talk, and maybe in the second half, you started framing some of the projects you presented as explicit attempts to not engage in the art world, or what you said, quote unquote, the real world, in opposition to. So in terms of your place in art,
gross.
so in a way, in terms of asking about your place in art history, while you're at least explicitly stating that you're not interested in art, I mean, I'm exaggerating, or it's a hyperbole, but it's an interesting kind of quandary of, here's an artist who is trying to not engage in certain respects, or at certain moments, not engage in the art world because of its limitations or strictures, and address a general public more directly via DIY projects, like you said, about controlling all aspects of it.
Mm.
So in a way, I mean, I'm putting words into your mouth. Maybe you don't need art history for.
Well, I recognize at the same time that this is kind of like, I mean, it's like, I have this parallel life, let's say, right? And where some of these projects address the world at large, whatever. There's such gross characterizations, but and some of them will, the art community will have a different kind of insight into, right? I mean, you'll have a different kind of insight into where I'm coming from if you know about Fluxus, for example, or about the history of the ready-made, or the history of minimalism, or conceptual art, and so on. Right? So yeah.
Okay. We unfortunately don't have time for all the questions, but I will.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I should have.
It's okay.
It's the pitfall of showing lots of images that you just get tempted to talk about them.
Yeah, there's always a extensive backstory to all of them. Maybe I'll finish off with an anonymous question.
No, why anonymous? So thrilling.
Which was the first question, and I think maybe is a fitting end, where it's specific to knitwork, but the question was if it ever reminds you of your mortality, given that it will end when you die. And does that scare you or discourage you from working on it?
Right. The yeah, it's like one of those things where sometimes, and this goes back to the notion of practice. Sometimes if you think about stuff too much, you just won't do it because it's just too frightening or too yeah, the thought is too scary. So sometimes, so that started out with a very innocent question, like what would it look like if you gathered together the entire product of a lifetime and you just kept doing the same thing, which is, to be fair, what we all do in our different ways. I mean, some of us make physical products and some of us make mental products, but we're all, like so many people, we do the same thing day in, day out. So it was an innocent question: what would that look like if you gathered that together in one place? And so the only way that I could see that, what the answer to that was to do it, right? So but if I had thought about the consequences of it, if I had thought that through, I might never have undertaken it. My friend Monica Tapp she's given me a title for my entire practice, which is, it seemed like a good idea at the time. and so, sometimes, you can think things through all you want, and of course the responsible thing is to do so, to think about the consequences of one's actions before one undertakes them. But at the same time, the spirit of experimentation is such that you can have a hypothesis, but you don't really know until you've done the experiment what the outcomes are. And I think a really good going back to some of these principles are that I think it's worth not assuming and really privileging the on the ground conditions, the actual observation of how things unfold in particular places, or what actually happens. That's that, rather than assume what things, rather than assume what conditions are. And so, I'm often careful to, when people want to describe my work as being conceptual, I'll often insist that, in fact, no, it's based, it's really physical and sensual work. Like, it's always, the work that I make is always based in for the viewer, I hope, in a kind of real physical and sensual encounter with a thing that is maybe then the starting point for a series of reflections upon the other phamomena that are implicated in things. And it's never just an abstract, like, thought about something. It only becomes substantial as it's concretized, to my mind. Anyway.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
I talked too much. I wanted to hear more from you folks.
It's also partly the nature of this
Yeah, I
mode
guess.
of interacting.
Yeah.
So thank you on behalf of the department and myself, of course.
Well, thank you very much for
And
the
it's
invitation.
nice. It's nice to see the BC sunlight behind you.
Oh, I had all great intentions of making you all very jealous to show you the West
Outdoors.
Coast behind me, but
Okay, those of you who are in the class, we're going to rejoin with the usual class Zoom link in 10 minutes at 8:30 precisely. And those of you who are not in the class, have a good evening. Bye.